Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. It's always so cool to hear from folks in this growing community. This week we heard from Steve in DC, who said our program is for all people who like to hear a range of thoughtful views from different perspectives without overzealous rhetoric. The host and the guests are excellent. Thank you very much. He says there are very few places today where one can listen to thoughtful Democrats and Republicans and religious leaders and regular folks talk about interesting topics without advocating an extreme position. More discussions like this would go a long way to resolve what divides us. Thank you so much, Steve. That is really nice of you to share with us. Really appreciate that. And yeah, that's what we're working towards. And with that, I am your host. Glad to be working to rebuild the political center with our co-host and co-producer, Emily Special Ops Matthews. Emily, so good to hang out with you. How you doing?
Good to see you. Doing well. How are you guys doing?
Good, good, good. And our guest today, it's my pleasure to welcome Michael Wear. Michael launched onto the scene as one of the youngest staffers in President Obama's administration. And I think I heard this right. Perhaps one of the youngest staffers in the modern history of the White House, where he served in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships from 2009 to 2012, and then led religious outreach for President Obama's reelection campaign. During 2020, the presidential campaign, Michael served as senior advisor to Not Our Faith PAC, a bipartisan effort that made a Christian case against the reelecting of Donald Trump. Today, Michael is the founder of Public Square Strategies, a consulting and research firm at the intersection of faith and public life. Michael is senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Christianity Today, and made other major publications. He's also an author of, among other contributions, one of the best books I've read in the last couple of years, Reclaiming Hope, and has a newsletter of the same name that I highly recommend, as well as a recent report he co-wrote for Trinity titled Christianity, Pluralism, and Public Life in the United States. I could go on and on. I've been going on and on too long already, but it's there's seriously so many more accomplishments I could point to. But we got to get into the conversation at some point. So Michael Wear, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Doing really well. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So let's just dive right in. I've heard you mention your mom, Genevieve, of course, but I've also heard you talk about your grandfather. I think you call him Papa in numerous places. Can you share what kind of influence they each had on you?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So my grandfather is sort of the looming, human personal influence in my life. He was an incredible man, served in World War II, came back, was a kind of towering civic, in my eyes, he was a civically minded kind of person, the kind of person that you'd go to if you had a problem or needed help, I should say, from Buffalo, New York. And so I grew up in Buffalo. My grandfather lived there for most of his life. And he was really a father figure for me. And so I think it's from him that I get my civic impulse. I didn't grow up in a very political family, certainly not a partisan one, but this sense of community and obligation was something that I grew up with and that he gave to me. My mother, such an interesting question. I'm really asked about her. A few, my mother, I think, had a life set out for herself that pretty early on, the story changed. So she had left her job to raise kids at home, and then found out that our financial situation as a family wasn't as good as she had been led to believe, and ended up having to go back to work, became a single mother. My parents were divorced when I was young, and I saw my mother in a situation not of her choosing, having to scrape together resources just to make life work in some way. And so there was obviously an influential person in my life, and also taught me quite a bit about what it means to make it as part of the working class in America, and what government resources mean when you need them, and why people need them, and gave me a perspective about poverty, about working class issues that I probably wouldn't, that I might not have otherwise.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get into some of the political conclusions that you arrived at, or some of the political positions that you were able to support because some of those values that were shaping earlier in your life. I was curious too, and Emily was curious too, about your religious formation.
So I grew up in Buffalo in a big Italian family where it just seemed like you were born Catholic, and everyone I knew was Catholic growing up for a long, for most of my early childhood, of course. But Buffalo itself, growing up, was a pretty Catholic community. I look back at it now and see that there were degrees of religious commitment among people, but growing up, it just seemed like, okay, this is what everyone is. And it seemed to me that growing up, it was like a religion of sort of cultural milestones, and it was a Catholicism of fish fries, and your favorite saints being the ones associated with the best holidays. Now, my grandfather would say that, it was the Lord who saw him through World War II, and he'd have stories attesting to that. And I could think now back to aunts who would sit in the corner of the living room, thumbing their rosaries. But as an adolescent and teenager, I kind of thought, this is family sort of tradition. This isn't religious belief so much as it is sort of habit. My sister, who's 5-6 years older than me, became a Christian, identified herself as a Christian a few years before I did. She started attending a church. She met some folks at the supermarket where she worked, a young married couple, and was drawn to them, and through that was introduced to the church, and then became more and more involved. And so all of a sudden I had like an evangelist next door, like literally the room over from me. And there's a longer story to tell here, but
somebody shared the book of Hezekiah with you.
yeah. As you could tell, I'm still not over that one. So you're referring to, I my sister took me to a youth group meeting, and one of her friends came up to me knowing I wasn't a Christian and asked me what my favorite book of the Bible was. And before I could answer, said the book of Hezekiah. And I said, oh gosh, that's my favorite too. You were just trying to get through the conversation. And it wasn't until years later I discovered that book doesn't exist. And
you like get to Malachi, you're like, wait, where's Hezekiah?
Yeah, it's like the meanest thing that you could do. But so I get out of that youth group, and on my way out, it obviously did not like it very much, but on my way out, there was a volunteer there who was handing out tracts of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. And instead of throwing it out, I took it home and read it over again, and it changed my life. 3 days later, I told my sister in the car as we were driving, she was dropping me off, that I had given my life to Christ. And as I already said, I had these sort of civic interests before I became a Christian. After I became a Christian, I thought for initially, well, now I need to go to seminary, become a pastor. You just kind of want to do the most religious thing you could think of. And thankfully, my pastor back home was like, Michael, look around. There are Christians who aren't pastors. And I thought, well, that's a very keen observation. And so early on in my life, the sort of vocational question was, what does it mean to be faithful in public things? And that led me to DC, that led me to George Washington University. It's eventually what led me to meeting and then working for President Obama. And it's, continued to be the central question of my life.
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-ups. I mean, things that I was thinking just in all of that, you mentioned your mom making it on her own and how that kind of shaped, I'm sure we'll get into that later, but your political thoughts on, welfare or, I can relate. I'm a moderate conservative, but my dad grew up, in working class family, single mom. They did not have much at all. And I know that she temporarily went on assistance, and those programs with the goal to get off then. But, when she couldn't stand on her own 2 feet, there's something really great about that. And it's a way that we can certainly love our neighbors and the vulnerable. But I was also going to say with, Catholicism being so cultural up there, that's so different for me, because being in the South, it's the Christian the Christian evangelical culture, which I was part of kind of in the 90s growing up, and then, kind of had to develop my own beliefs, and I've challenged kind of so many things. My faith has remained intact, but I feel like I've challenged a lot of the stuff that's cultural Christianity versus actual Christianity. And, we have so many self-help Christian books out and commentary, which is great. But what really changed my life, Romans also changed my life, but just reading the Bible front to back and actually really getting into it and challenging everything. And, for me, that was definitely what changed my life. So I think that's really cool that Romans had such an impact on me.
You both mentioned Romans. I'm curious, what was it about Romans for each of you that was life changing?
That's a good question. Michael, do you want to go first? I'm thinking, it's one of my favorite books. I don't know if I can put together a
Well, I'll give you a teaser. For me, it was the first book in the New Testament that I read was James. And that basically was my ticket into the New Testament, which makes sense. Growing up Jewish, it starts out the first couple of verses to the 12 tribes. I'm like, hey, he's talking to me. But then even more specifically to my Jewish formation, I started in Matthew. And by the 5th chapter, this Jesus character was given what I recognized to be a Devar Torah. And frankly, by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, this is hands down the most brilliant Devar Torah I'd ever, which is like it's like a explanation of what we've been reading in Torah. And this is the most brilliant. And I didn't connect it. I didn't know that this was the famous Sermon on the Mount. So and then I just couldn't put it down. I just went to Revelation 22 within probably a 24-hour period.
There's just so much. It is such a good outline of what the gospel is. I think that really, clarified so many things for me, because it is such a good summation of, like you were saying, everything that.
So what was it for you, Michael? Romans, you mentioned.
So I had all of the sort of pseudo intellectual one-liners that we have and that the culture gives. Religion is a crutch. Religion is for those who can't face reality. Religion doesn't have much substance to it, and all of that's like, none of that holds up to Romans. Like you could read through Romans and reject Jesus after you read it, but you can no longer pretend like the question has not been asked. Like you can no longer, like once you ring that bell, it is rung, and you can no longer say there's no there. And so that was really, powerful, really powerful to me. It also it's a sense making book. You read it and it's something that you could hold up to reality and it fits, like it's like, oh, this is what things look like.
You want answers? We have answers.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I appreciate you sharing your testimony. One of the things I love about when I've heard you share it is that it doesn't become a fishing story. You know what I mean? Like, there's too many stories. Oh, I came kicking and screaming to the Lord, and I was so down and out and on the brink. And it's not to say that those stories don't happen, but oftentimes it seems like folks turn their 5-pound trout into a great white shark of a salvation story. So I've always appreciated when I've heard you share it. But I wanted to jump right into reclaiming hope. In the book, you shared, I came of age during a time when the religious right had great influence and many Christians were coming to accept that some of the tactics of that movement actually caused damage to the witness of the American church. At the very time I became a Christian, it seemed many of my peers had an increasingly negative perception of Christians. The evangelical political leaders that dominated political news seemed little like the evangelicals I knew and worshiped with in Buffalo or at my church in Washington. Yet those were the folks who had the Republican Party's ear. When I read that, it's so different to when I first became a Christian. We were going to the church we were attending. We put our kids in a Christian school, and the social political orthodoxy was even more strongly held than, you wouldn't hear a heated debate about baptism, although our church had a specific position on it, or how to take communion, even though our church had a specific position on it. But if you said a negative word about Sarah Palin, or, forget about even uttering an ounce of support for Obama, you'd be taken into the Matthew 18, how to deal with sinners process. So it sounds like you experienced a very different, more pluralistic, politically pluralistic when you first became a Christian.
I think one thing that I've had to learn is, and this goes back to what Emily said, which is that I came to evangelicalism knowing what it was culturally and politically. And all of that was figured into, I knew all that before I made a commitment to Jesus. I think what many sort of millennials who were raised in the church are going through is that there was no distinction between the theological, the cultural, the political in their experience growing up. And then they came to understand, wait, similar to me growing up as a Catholic in Buffalo, there are Catholics who aren't blue collar labor union supporting Democrats, but I thought that was Catholicism. There are many evangelicals who are coming to understand, wait, a belief in salvation was tied up with a certain Republican brand of politics. When I became a Christian, I saw the politics, but from the outside looking in, it was really clear to me that the predominant politics of evangelicalism was not synonymous with some of the core theological claims of evangelicalism as I was introduced to it. So, right, there is no direct sort of line between the Bebington Quadrilateral and support of the and opposition to the estate tax. That is those are separate judgments. And so that was, in some ways, it was helpful to me. In other ways, my experience in evangelicalism has just been much better than those who the many who were raised as evangelicals and those who were in different, my evangelical church was led by a pastor with a PhD who was trained at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, who minored in college in political science, who was reading Dallas Willard and reading Richard Foster. That's not the whole of evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is a tremendously diverse movement in this country that comprises, when I came to faith, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the population, and you could even say higher than that if you include other strains of sort of Protestantism in your definition of evangelical. So it's my approach to evangelicalism and my experience of evangelicalism has been one that disaggregates popular expressions of political expressions within evangelicalism from sort of the core theological commitments.
I can relate to that. To an extent. I think growing up right outside of Atlanta, it's different than other more rural parts of Georgia or, the South. So there's definitely a lot of that more, this is going to sound snobby, but intellectual overflow, a lot of those kinds of pastors. And I think my parents discovered a really great church later when I was in college. And funny enough, I ended up discovering Campus Crusade in college. I had knew about it, but being super involved in Campus Crusade, which has a strong PCA influence, Presbyterian Church of America, which funny enough was where my parents started going. Our lives were kind of changing at the same time. The pastor that I had in college at Crusade is now there, took over as the head pastor at their huge church in Duluth, Georgia. So it's just kind of this cool full circle thing. But it really, when you can kind of shed a lot of that cultural influence or, things that are Christianese versus actual faith, I think that really is important. I think we definitely share that, which is cool.
Yeah.
And to bring it into very current events, I just saw a study, I think, and it was David French who just wrote about it over the weekend, that 2016 compared to 2020. I'm guessing that you read it too, because you referenced, Michael, the Bevington, what do you call it again? The
Bevington quadrilateral.
Yeah. But the stat that was quoted was that there are more people who support Donald. So of the people who support Donald Trump, a higher percentage of them identify as evangelicals. But when you dive a little bit deeper into the numbers, there are folks who are identifying now, who are Trump supporters, who are identifying as evangelical, but they wouldn't, once you ask other questions about, well, do you go to church? Do you believe in the Bible? Do you, the things that would, in the past have identified, were defining evangelical, they don't go to church. So it's an interesting moment that we're in.
Well, so I do think it's really important to identify the fact that this is the extension of something that has been developing over the last 50 years. This is not something that Trump created. David Campbell and Robert Putnam wrote in American Grace about exactly this. And well, if we are looking at religious and political dynamics solely through the lens of Donald Trump and what he did to our politics, we're going to be missing quite a bit.
It's a really good point.
And the over-identification of Christianity with a particular political party did not just happen before Trump, but I have to say, it was cultivated by some of the same people who now are trying to put all of the blame on Donald Trump. But Donald Trump was building on an architecture that had been built by the religious right, with whom many of these people consorted and supported for decades. And so we have to see that this architecture, yes, Donald Trump was the most blatant instrument to show what a misguided project that was. But it was misguided before Donald Trump. Now, prudentiality of our politics is not something that was invented or that just came. It's not like, I often hear people talk as if Donald Trump was the first time that they really had to really think about who they were voting for. And I want to say there should have been more tension before Donald Trump. Just to use a specific example, Al Mohler wrote that in 2016, it was the first time that he had to dedicate an ounce of mental energy. This is paraphrasing, but what he said is, if anything, I'm understating what he wrote. The first time he had to dedicate an ounce of mental energy to who he voted for in a presidential election. And look, there were very difficult issues on the ballot before 2016. And so, that Pew survey is important. Pew has been picking up on the ways in which, again, the over-identification of Christianity with a particular brand of politics, especially on younger people, has been pushing people away from the faith for at least a couple decades.
Right. Yeah, I think you referred to political sectarianism. We interviewed Linda Feldman of the Christian Science Monitor on this very thing, how folks are taking their politics as religion. So again, tying it into Trump supporters, they may not go to church, but they go to rallies. They may not have their kids baptized, but there's these other acts of not worship per se, but it does border on worship, so taking the secular and vested, but this is not anything new in history for political movements or movements of empire to kind of hijack the language of the Bible or use religious symbols.
One thing I will just say though is, I think the increasing sophistication of political technology, the ways in which politics is able to saturate our culture and our churches in ways that it just couldn't before, really amplify this dynamic. You referred to the concept of political sectarianism, which I think is just one of the most important sort of academic sort of frameworks that's been developed to describe our politics as it is in recent years. And it's been unfortunate. It hasn't gotten the attention that it should, although, a bunch of social scientists should know better than to release a defining framework in December of 2020 in between the election and the insurrection. It's going to be, there was a lot going on at the time.
A little bit.
But I would urge people to look it up. It's a very brief sort of 4 or 5 page document that's signed on by, I think, about 16 of the leading social scientists in the country. And they define the particular kind of polarization, political polarization that we have today as political sectarianism, which is held up by 3 pillars. That is moralism, what I refer to as a misplaced moralism. I don't think moralism is a bad thing if it's oriented in the right direction. The problem is we have a misplaced moralism. Othering, so othering your political opponents and those who are sort of in your sights when it comes to the political arena, and then an aversion, a politics of aversion. And I think this really helps clarify. I think people often react to it's becoming hard to talk about things like polarization or civility. The people now have this like fallback line of, there was no golden age and like all that is true, but how about we focus on what's in front of us now? We don't need to say, let's go back to some other time in order to say that there are serious dysfunctions in the way that we're operating today. And how about we look to the future and the kind of politics that we want to build moving forward?
Yeah. When you shared that, it was on another interview that I think you gave an interview in August where you shared those 3 pillars of political sectarianism. And it made so much sense because just on an individual basis, that moralism, the primary moral, if you want to call it that, or the primary value is having the right degree of aversion or even hatefulness for those others.
That's right.
And those others are so as broadly defined as anyone who has one drop of difference or one drop of impure thoughts about Donald Trump in this case, since we're talking about him.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the book. You described something, and this is a sort of symbolic moment. You describe a historic meeting then Senator Obama had with evangelical leaders in June of 2008. It seemed to reveal, for lack of a better word, the prejudices of some of the folks on the campaign, as well as some of the evangelical leaders that were there. But for you, there seemed to be some small victories in that meeting, like in the prayer the attendees participated in at the end of the meeting. Can you describe that meeting, if you remember it, and what some of your takeaways were?
Yeah. So the meeting was held in right after Barack Obama wrapped up the Democratic nomination. And it was in a Chicago high-rise right by campaign headquarters with about 30 evangelical leaders. The fact that the meeting took place was a victory in itself. It sent the message, very clear message in my view, that he truly intended on being president for all Americans, and that evangelicals were going to have a seat at the table, that conservatives were going to have a seat at the table. And there were people in that meeting that we knew were not going to vote for the president, that there was persuasion involved. We obviously hoped that there would be some. I mean, one thing that's helpful about being at on a campaign is that there's no sort of mistaking sort of what your role is. When I was faith outreach director for Barack Obama, it was helpful that in my job description was electing him. Like there's no like manipulation involved. There's no like if people
I'm on your team.
If I'm calling, it's for that purpose. And so obviously like a meeting like that is in the context of a presidential campaign, and like everyone knows that. So there's no like weird sort of but what it also was an opportunity for evangelicals to speak and be heard by and be responded to one of the two people who was going to be the next president of the United States. There were Franklin Graham was there. Bishop T.D. Jakes was there. Heads of major evangelical institutions were there. I think I tell a story in my book. The range of questions were on everything from poverty to climate change. It was particularly, striking to me when one of the attendees said that resonated so much with the president's language and care for the vulnerable. But for pro-life evangelicals, what was difficult was they didn't see why that ethic didn't extend to the unborn. And it wasn't a political there were no reporters there. The president took the question seriously. The question was asked earnestly. And so I walk out of that meeting just thinking like, obviously everyone didn't agree on everything walking out. I'm pretty sure the majority of the folks there didn't vote for Barack Obama, but you left that meeting thinking, oh, this is, and just Barack Obama made me think this way many times over my years of working for him and following him. And obviously we'll probably get to other aspects of the book where this wasn't my main takeaway, but a meeting like that, I left thinking, this is what Christianity and the role of Christianity in public life and how Christians interact in public. This is how a viable vision for the and more healthy version of what that could look like in the 21st century. At a time when a lot of the narratives were either on the far right, like a doomsday, we're losing power, gotta like grasp on, or on the left, what Barack Obama decried as the practical absurdity of demanding religious people that they leave their faith outside of politics. For me, is when I came to faith and early in my faith walk and to now, both of those options are untenable to me. A sort of a domineering, imposing Christianity in a pluralistic society, or one in which religious commitments are muted or excised. Neither of those seems to live up to our commitments as a government and as a liberal democracy, and then B, most importantly, that they don't seem to fit with the call of the gospel and the reality of the world in which we live.
So yeah, a couple follow-up things to that. I think, you said people get all upset about bringing faith into the politics, but the funny thing is everybody brings their faith into politics. If they're unbelievers, if they're believers, there's people the far left wants, the government to control and tell everybody else how to live. The far right wants the same, but from what they think is a biblical perspective. But I think what you're saying about, liberal democracy and the old tradition of that is give people the freedom, just, protect people's rights. And that's the point of the government. That's why I'm, stand where I stand on that. But two things I was going to ask you about, you brought up the pro-life thing, how that created tension potentially within the White House once you were finally in the White House, and kind of what was, if you feel comfortable sharing Obama's response to, would he welcome your opinions on that? That's question number one. Well, to answer that, and then we'll get to my next follow-up.
Yeah, so I think like the president had identified early on that any story that you were going to tell about turning the page on the culture wars or that kind of thing, if you didn't confront abortion, then the whole project was kind of a farce. In other words, like you can't say you're going to turn the page on the culture wars and pursue abortion politics in the same way it always has been pursued. His sort of effort, which was really like self-initiated, 5 months into his presidency, less than 5 months into his presidency, was to go to Notre Dame and give what became a highly sort of, even before he showed up, a very controversial commencement address. And what, again, what was stunning to me is, I mean, traditionally, if you're a Democrat, you head into a religious space like that, then your aim is to, first of all, most Democrats want to choose to put themselves in that position. If they were going to choose to do so, they'd try to focus on something, just try and find a sliver of agreement on like the most favorable terrain. So you're going to a Catholic university, give a speech. Notre Dame has a long history of nuclear disarmament stuff. So give a speech on nuclear disarmament, or give a speech on creation care. And instead, the president, in some ways to the,
to the dismay of his handlers.
All of his advisors weren't on board with this. The president says, I'm going to give a talk on abortion. That's what all the controversy is about me coming anyway. So I'm going to approach that issue. And he gave a speech on what he called reducing the number of women seeking abortions. Mm-hmm. Now, even this was a significant battle, which, I tell the story, he actually changed the language on Air Force One on his way to South Bend, because political staff, so we had an abortion fight during the political convention, and political staff had hammered out with all the advocacy groups, quote unquote, a compromise, which was the language in the 2008 Democratic platform is reducing the need for abortion, which is one of those compromises which upsets everyone and satisfies no one, right? Like the pro-choice left doesn't want to set as a North Star reducing abortions, and those pro-lifers on the right don't want to say that there's a need for abortion. They don't think there's a need for it. So that's the language that gets put into the president's speech, and he goes, wait, I'm not giving a speech about, but like I want to reduce abortions without violating Roe v. Wade. So why don't I just say that? And that's what he did. You read the speech, and he gives a pretty moving speech, drawing firm lines about what his commitments are. He never sort of suggested he was anything but pro-choice, but also, I mean, it seems conventional now because, again, you have quite a few never Trump sort of folks who are now all about reducing abortions and that kind of thing. It's important. Like, no one gave him, part of me is, where were these people in 2009? Like it would have been helpful then. But in 2009, he gave this message about we could strengthen adoption in this country. We could increase maternal care. We could end pregnancy discrimination in the workplace. And it was a way to step in. So, now I tell that story. What happened as his administration went on is abortion got caught up in Affordable Care Act politics. And there was, I have a whole chapter on this in Reclaiming Hope, but like the short version is that Democrats often tend to think that these cultural issues can be waved away and like really won't be problems. And they are always the problem at the end of the day, right? Like everything had been negotiated, Cornhusker kickbacks or whatever it was, like all that was done. But what was the 72-hour crisis? It was, we have like 12.5 pro-life Democrats who won't vote for this bill unless it prohibits funding for abortion. That fight, no one was satisfied with that. And then, of course, we had the contraception mandate, and that kind of blew up the hopes for common ground being built on abortion during the president's time in office. The strain of those policy debates that ended up bringing in abortion politics, both on the right and the left, sort of made, when we came into office, there was a vision of like rolling out a abortion reduction slate of policies. And, in my mind, having a press conference that had Richard Land and Cecile Richards on a podium together, like staunch pro-lifers and staunch pro-choicers saying, this is a way forward, that we didn't get everything we want, but this is a positive way. And by the time we got to 2011, 2012, that was it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we just touched on this, but when you were in President Obama's White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, you had described an experience early on in the administration when a development event for young staffers, after introducing yourself, saying, the office that you worked in, a senior staffer interrupted you and began a rant about the separation of church and state, what he deemed to be the impropriety of the whole endeavor. Could you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, it was like so this is ostensibly a leadership development day for White House staffers, and sort of randomly assigned a table, and I can't remember if I actually put names in the book. So no,
you I think you just said the second most senior staffer at that meeting.
Yeah. So the most senior staffer at that meeting is even more senior today, and so and everyone kind of knew that. So it was. So I am probably a 21, 22-year-old staffer at that time, just trying to cultivate my leadership, learn something,
That's so young.
Yeah, very young. And there was the second most senior staffer who, you would hope would view his role as serving the staffers that were lower on the totem pole in that, and like being supportive. And instead, we just went around introducing ourselves and our roles. And I literally just described the position the president had appointed me to, which was, I'm at the faith-based office. We oversee centers across the federal government. And this guy who works for the same person I do.
Yeah, you're like, go talk to Obama about it if you don't like it.
Breaks into a tirade about, that structure really makes it difficult to get rid of it, doesn't it? Really puts the teeth of faith and exactly right, Emily. I was like, take it up with him. Like, who am I defending myself to? If I need to defend myself to you, then yeah, take it up with the guy who put both of us here. But here's what's, and this was true in that meeting. It was also true throughout my time in government, and I see it today, which is, it's really important we understand when we come to political disagreement, and this is both in community with one another, it's also the people you're watching on TV, the people who are in decision-making roles. And that it's, when it comes to issues of faith, there is so often an ideological pretense when actually what's motivating are very deep sort of wounds and personal experiences. Mm-hmm. And the person had a mean Catholic school teacher when they were in the second grade, and that experience stuck with them. They had a parent who converted to a religion and wasn't the same anymore. I mean, all of these very deep, and then people bring that to politics. Now, that doesn't mean that the thing to do is, when you're in a political argument, say, what's your deep personal wound here?
It's some 20-year-old kid talking.
Yeah, that's right. The lesson is, though, our politics would be so much healthier if we tried to carry in our minds what Parker Palmer wrote, which is that we have a politics that's full of brokenhearted people. Mm. And we have a political culture now that is so good at dehumanizing people. And we need to recognize just how deeply human our politics is. And I tried to remember that even when I was in very serious sort of disagreements when I was working in government. I try to remember that now. Now, that doesn't solve all the problems. Like, deeply wounded people with power can hurt people. And so that's not to sort of spiritualize the whole thing. It is to, again, understand that your politics is about people. It's not just about abstract sort of concepts and sort of maneuvering your way into imposing your will. It's about building community together. It's about self-governance.
I agree. Did you feel like that was kind of an isolated incident, or was it something that you just kind of had to get used to? And do you think Obama sort of knew these kinds of things, you know, or had a take on it?
Yeah, I mean, so this person, they were, again, a relatively senior person, but a senior person with no role in policymaking. Now, what I will say is, I do think we have a structural problem in our politics, which is that the way this is, no matter what administration, there are so many positions that matter that have to be filled somehow. And where administrations go to fill those positions has consequences. And so, like, just I saw so often real decisions happening at the level of the low to mid-level staffer who was a grassroots organizer a year before, making, whatever, like $10 an hour, who's now in a position that, yes, there are, like, hypothetically layers of authority over that person. But I mean, I'll give you one example. There was a very well-known pastor who ran a prisoner reentry program that was celebrating its, like, 10th or 20th anniversary, and requested a letter of commendation from the president. Like, the president doesn't know what's happening. It's something that runs through, like, a bureaucratic process. Usually it's, like, super simple, but there's an Office of Presidential Correspondence that runs a vet of the religious leader. And just to be clear, they'd run a vet of anyone the president is writing a letter to. So it could be the head of a nonprofit. It could be, and so it wasn't a vet because he was a religious person. It was a vet because, I just want to be very clear, it was a vet because he was requesting a letter from the president. Well, this was a person who had, well, I'll say this person was in the meeting with then Senator Obama in the Chicago high-rise. This was a person who had met with the president in the Oval Office. This was like the horse had left the barn. and the decision to let the horse out of the barn was made by President Obama. And yet this low-level staffer who had no religious experience, who was empowered functionally to make this decision, but the president didn't know who he was. And this really was, but a vet came back. The religious leader had said something about some issue, and it was a months long bureaucratic struggle in which all kinds of, like, people had to adjudicate this decision from someone who was, like, a grassroots organizer in Nevada, for 9 months for a presidential campaign. All of that that may seem like a small decision, but what is the message sent throughout government, and what are the ripples of the decision to say this religious leader is disqualified by virtue of A, B, or C from receiving contact from the president on the basis of this person's decision? That happens at the policy level, happens at the political level. And the main point is that I left government thinking about the ways in which our bureaucracy is filled, the way in which political appointments are filled, and how we are cultivating public servants. What is the character that we want to cultivate for those who will be in public leadership? And maybe that's a different process than the kinds of people that we need to cultivate for campaign work and the hand-to-hand combat of politics. And yet we don't really have two pipelines for that work. The people who work at Center for American Progress or work at Heritage, it's a revolving door between that and the political campaigns. But those are two very different environments. And I worked in both. I worked in government and I worked in campaign. They're two very different environments.
Yeah, two different animals.
And it might not always be the right fit for the same person.
I want to, there's so much more I could ask you about your time in the White House and on the 2012 campaign, but I know we're starting to run short on time. So I'd like to ask you about the report that was recently published. You co-wrote for the Trinity Forum. It's called Christianity, Pluralism, and Public Life in the U.S. You interviewed 51 Christian leaders, mostly pastors, to explore how our leaders, political and religious leaders, and the rest of us can contend with social, political, and religious pluralism in our culture. What were you hoping to achieve with the report? And then what were some of the main takeaways?
Yeah, so the main contention driving my work right now is the desire to place the resources of Christianity in direct contact with the challenges that we're facing today publicly. When I think the experience of many, both Christians and non-Christians, has been that the faith is primarily about personal edification, enjoyment, sort of community building, and in the case of Christianity, a sort of social capital, a sort of way to signify your place in society, while being irrelevant to reality. And so you could have entire conversations about pluralism or entire conversations about public policy, entire conversations about how we treat one another in public. And Christianity, for many, has no application, because once you get into public, then there are different sort of logic paths to get there, but they all basically end up in the place that God is just like ill-equipped for public stuff. That when you get into politics, that's corrupt. And right, this was like the Trump logic, which is like, you can't worry about being Christian in politics. Allow me to be your bully for you, and I'll protect the space for you to be Christian in your personal life. Like, that's the best you could hope for. The best you could hope for is that you carve out space to like be Christian in your marriage and with your finances. But politics, you need a bully there. That is actually a very similar line of logic that liberals and progressives have used for Christians, which is like, your faith doesn't hold up here. And so it was like a great irony of history that in 2016, all of a sudden you had all these progressives beating Christians over the head, metaphorically, saying, what happened to your values? What happened? And I think many Christians were like, wait, you spent the last several decades telling me that my faith has no place in public. Now you're asking where my values are? They're at home where you said I should keep them. So the report, and so much else of my work, is what are the resources within Christianity, both practices, ways of thinking about other people, ways of thinking about our place in God's creation, ways of thinking about what is ultimate and what is prudential, that actually prepare us and equip us for pluralistic life. Yeah. And so that touches on everything from an understanding of the idea that each and every person is made in the image of God. It comes from Christian concept of hospitality and what that looks like. It comes from drawing on the lessons of Jeremiah 29, this idea that we ought to seek the peace and welfare of the city to which God has planted us, even though the exiles were not placed in a friendly environment. And so I co-authored the report with Amy Black, and our hope was to provide Christians with resources to reorient their thinking toward pluralism, so that they were not thinking about pluralism primarily as a source of threat or as a reason why they must sort of vacate their beliefs, but actually that this emerging increasingly pluralistic America was actually a call to draw on the resources of their faith in maybe a way that they hadn't before. And then the second aim was to help civic leaders, secular leaders, understand that we still live in a predominantly Christian country in terms of demographics. The vast majority of Americans identify as Christian. And the way to cultivate a healthy pluralism is not to exclude Christian ideas and therefore in some like fundamental way Christians themselves from that project of building. So like a major hope of our report was to provide civic leaders with an understanding that there are resources within Christianity which can support some of the basic goals that civic leaders might have in just having a harmonious society and having a society where people care for one another and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a really informative report, both for religious folks as well as secular folks. It's packed with references and stats and surveys. So really commend it. You can get it off the Michael Wear website. I think it's just Michael Wear, WEAR.com. Worth the read, worth the time to look into. So before we wrap, I wanted to ask you, you support World Relief, which is worldrelief.org. Could you tell us a little bit about that organization?
Yeah, World Relief is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. And, especially, they're kind of on the front lines of two, really now three significant crises we're facing. The refugee crisis in the Northern Triangle, the Haitian crisis, and then they're going to be key in supporting the integration of Afghan refugees. And so I've worked with them over the years. They have a wonderful new CEO who's supported by a vice president for government affairs, a woman by the name of Jenny Yang, who is just one of the exemplars of Christian civic leadership in the country, in my view. And Matthew Sorens, who is a longtime leader and voice around issues of immigration reform and that kind of thing. And so World Relief is doing great public leadership. They're doing great actual service delivery. And I'm happy to support them along with, an array of organizations that are going to be needed to confront these challenges and the great human need that's there right now.
Great organization. It's worldrelief.org if you want to get more information or find out how to support it. Now I have one more question and one important piece of business. Do you have any questions for us?
Sure. I'm interested in areas in our politics where you think a faith engagement would be most helpful right now. Where are the greatest needs that you see right now for constructive engagement?
You're leaving that up to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's clear we've talked about this so many times, Michael, but the pro-life issue is so important to me. And we talked, when we did Biden Republicans this summer or last summer about how that issue is so important to me. And I think you kind of hit on sometimes Democrats can have a tunnel vision on that and not realize how key that is to so many more conservative voters. It was something I had to really wrestle with in voting for Biden this time. It was my first time voting for a Democrat for president. And I think it's just important to have, I don't know if this is answering your question at all, but to really work on initiatives to communicate what you just communicated about Obama and the fight to, and I know you're doing this, but the fight to message better on that and message that there are other ways, and David French has hit on this as well, to personally create an environment where abortion rates go down. And that it's not like we're pro-abortion, but that, we just have different approaches to it. I don't know if that was if that kind of falls into the realm of what you were asking.
No, absolutely. I think it's necessary. I will say President Biden certainly has every resource available to him, his own personal history, the fact that he has a long track record on these issues and knows sort of the history of debate here. He's not just in sort of, he doesn't have to be someone who's shaped simply by the moment when it comes, but he has not brought those resources to bear as president, in my view. And now we're in a situation where this issue is now increasingly at the center of our politics. And I'm watching very closely to see if he understands the choice that he has between pouring more sort of gasoline on the fire or having an empathetic approach that at least hears the best, most sincere claims of quote unquote the other side. That's what he's done for so much of his career.
I mean, it's what won him. It won over people like me.
Right.
You know, I think it's politically smart too, if nothing else, because, you know, the base is going to vote for you no matter what, if you're the nominee. And so winning over, there were a lot of people that were friends of mine that were like, I just can't vote for him because he's jumped on the Hyde Amendment and who knows, you know, but it's politically smart, if nothing else, I think, for him to kind of work on that.
No, I agree. I would refer folks, there's a great, it's important. So often when this issue comes up, it's helpful on both the right and the left. It is convenient to act as if this is an issue which only affects white evangelicals. And yes, white evangelicals tend to care about this issue a great deal. You read the Texas Monthly essay from the last couple of weeks on why we saw so many Hispanic voters in Texas and elsewhere vote for Trump and vote for Republicans in 2020. And you'll see even Democratic groups, they don't want to say it too loudly because they're worried that they'll get phone calls from others. But even Democratic advisor groups have to say, look, this issue is causing us trouble. Actually, Emily, very, very quickly, I'll just add here, you know, once again, and it was very obvious, like this was an issue in 2008 and 2012. And yet the party seems to forget until, 3 weeks before the election, I'm getting calls from campaign folks saying, what can we do on this issue? We're running up against it in our door-to-door knocking in what are supposed to be Democratic areas. And I'm like, well, you can't concoct. So like the campaign actually has to give you something to work with. And so if it's coming up, I'm glad to get the call, glad to be helpful, but you need to also report that up the chain through the campaign. You can't just, you need to be able to deliver a message that's being affirmed by the candidate, not just put out propaganda. And so yeah, we could go on that, but I certainly agree. It's an area where on both the right and the left, a sort of sincere Christian contribution would be really helpful.
Well, we saw just recently here in California, the numbers reaffirmed one of the things that you're talking about.
That's right.
That in particular, Latino men were not supportive, or I should say, were supportive of the recall, which means they didn't go in Democrats' favor in this recall election. And one of the issues was the inhospitable environment for folks, religious folks. So when you asked that question, the first thing that came to mind are the missed opportunities, some of those missed opportunities in Obama's administration. For example, there were religious organizations that could have been allies, that could have made it easier to pass the Affordable Care Act, but found themselves up against other values that were uncompromising. I think that's an opportunity, especially now when there's any number of folks who have for their entire lives considered themselves to be conservatives that are now without a political home, right? And for me, my conservatism is based on my deference to the authority of Scripture, but that also opens up the door for issues that I could work hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with folks who've considered themselves liberals or progressives their whole lives. Our church, fortunately, we have a church in Pasadena that is doing great work in the area for the folks without homes right now. They're doing great work. And it doesn't look like a conservative issue, but if you're reading your Bible, it's a very conservative issue for folks that are immigrants. There are any number of things that I think we can find common cause on, so there is a place for that. If it's okay for me to have these transcendent beliefs that inform my political positions. But if, to your point, I'm going to get pushback merely for believing in God, then it's only sign of trouble to come. So, but I'm hopeful. I think that, I think there's an opportunity for reclaiming hope. Speaking of which, how can we find you, your Reclaiming Hope newsletter, your work with Public Square Strategies, or any of your other work?
Yeah, it's great. So my website is just michaelware.com. My wife and I run the newsletter you mentioned, which runs multiple times a week. And you could sign up for that at reclaiminghope.substack.com. And then you could usually find me on Twitter, and my handle is just Michael R. Ware. So hope to see you on there as well.
That's awesome. Well, this is a real pleasure getting to hang out with you. I will be in DC pretty soon, so I want to look you up and buy you a beer or something. And thanks to Emily for joining us. This is a treat having you. And as always, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, tell us a friend about us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you've heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.